This is Politics Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. In case you haven't noticed, there's a lot going on in America right now. This past weekend, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered two major rulings, including a repeal of Roe v. Wade that will impact the lives and rights of millions of Americans. Over the past several decades, a powerful political movement has arisen in the U.S. which prioritizes abortion above almost all other issues, which grooms and influences judges who take specific positions, and which turns out millions of voters in each election, specifically based on a promise to change the courts and do things such as overturn Roe v. Wade. Now this movement has actually achieved its goal, installed a conservative Supreme Court, and overturned Roe v. Wade. Those ideas will go from theory into reality. State legislatures around the country are acting swiftly to roll back these rights, and the country faces an important inflection point heading into the 2022 election about many rights and institutions that took decades, if not centuries, to build, what all these radical sudden changes actually mean, and what we can do to protect our future now. Our very own Justin Higgins and John Gunnison had a fascinating conversation about this. If you'd like to hear more past episodes or sign up for our newsletter, which will deliver our best of directly to your inbox, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode coming this Friday. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
John, how are you doing this evening? It's been quite an eventful last, really, 5 days in politics here.
Indeed. Yeah, I just got back from New York City. I'm back up here in Boston, and a lot has happened in the time that I was away, just one weekend.
Yes, I had a friend up actually from Florida. Not that anybody cares, but while he was up, we had the Bruin versus U.S. pistol, I believe, case come out, which struck down 100 years of firearm laws in New York regarding conceal and carry. We had then the next day, gun rights bill pass and be signed into law. And then I believe the next day we had the Supreme Court's abortion ruling. So Roe v. Wade was overturned. And this was all in the span of like 72 hours. Since then, we've seen protests are up nationwide, still in their nascent stages, and people become really upset. So, folks, we wanted to walk you through the abortion decision and the overturning of Roe v. Wade, what that looks like from a practical standpoint of the implications, what could be done legislatively before the November elections, and the implications on the November elections. So, John, when looking at what happened with Roe v. Wade, it strikes me as something similar to the draft opinion that was leaked. Do you have that same opinion? And if so, were you surprised?
Because it happened on the weekend and I was away, I didn't really get the chance to compare the texts and see how closely the formal opinion matches the leaked draft. But from all the analysis that I've been reading, it seems as though it mirrors it pretty closely. It was written by Sam Alito, just like the draft was. I think that at the time, there was speculation that if there was going to be movement, it would be in the direction of where John Roberts and possibly Brett Kavanaugh were believed to be on the issue, which was a little bit softer, redefining the standard as established in Roe without throwing it out entirely. And it appears as though the Dobbs ruling that was released, written by Sam Alito, just like the draft, has overturned Roe v. Wade entirely. We had an opportunity to talk about the draft with Delia Lithwick. That was one of our recent episodes. And I think that that is a good place to start for people who want to get a little bit more of the legal analysis and understand this issue from the perspective that legal scholars and judges look at it. It was pretty interesting how Delia Lithwick described to us that even though she is a very strong supporter of the policy ramifications of the Roe decision, she acknowledged a lot of the criticisms of the legal merits of Roe and described how those 7 male, mostly Republican appointed justices back in 1973 tried to define women's right to an abortion through privacy and substantive due process instead of the equal protection rationale that other scholars like Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg preferred, and how that's left a little bit of a vulnerability in the legal underpinnings of Roe. And I guess what this really brings us back to, Justin, is something that you sort of alluded to, which was that the Roe decision was perhaps not the firmest ground on which to rest the federal right to an abortion. And perhaps there should have been some legislative activity to establish that right through the law. And this was something that was never really taken up as a priority by Congress in the 50 years since Roe.
Yeah, and we hear a lot from our friends on the progressive side that the Democrats just didn't care, that they didn't try to get anything done. And I would argue that they didn't have the votes. Even people will be like, oh, well, there was a supermajority under President Obama. You didn't need to remove the filibuster. And people need to realize when we're looking at the legislative landscape of today and the polarization that we have in our country, that was not the case back in 2000 or even 2006 or 1990. So you can't say that, well, because today it's very likely, potentially, that the Democrats will remove the filibuster when they get the chance and pass some type of codification. That's not how it was back then. So we all need to understand that the Democrats really didn't have the opportunity to do so, because even in 2010, which is the most recent history when there was a supermajority in all three branches with the Democrats controlling the White House, the U.S. House, and then the 60-seat Senate, there were, John, you know this, there were pro-life Democrats back then.
Justin, the Senate Majority Leader was pro-life, or at least as far as we knew. I mean, he had said at certain points of career, we're talking about Harry Reid, who was U.S. Senator from Nevada and was a very powerful majority leader on the Democratic side, and was majority leader at the time Justin's talking about when Obama was in office.
And he played hardball like progressives wish that this administration would do.
Yeah. He's often looked at as being more of a McConnell than a Schumer, someone who's a bit ruthless in the way that he approached Senate rules and legislative strategy. But at certain points in his career, he identified as being pro-life. I think partly because of his Mormon background. But I don't know at what point he may or may not have evolved in that issue. I think as the majority leader, he sometimes spoke in a way that suggested that he had adopted the consensus of his caucus and was now pro-choice. But because there were never any real votes on this, it's a little bit ambiguous. I mean, there are Democrats in the Senate caucus today who have at certain times in their career identified as being pro-life as well. One that I can think of is Senator Bob Casey from Pennsylvania. I know that there were a couple others as well. So there's a little bit of ambiguity. Was that Kerry?
There was a senator from Nebraska.
Yeah. Maybe one of the Udalls.
Yeah, I think so. We're going to have to pull it up. But anyways, folks, there were 5 or 6 or 7 of that 60 that were pro-life at least. So when you hear the argument, oh, Democrats should have done this sooner from the progressives, or you hear the argument from the Republicans, Democrats have used Roe v. Wade to fundraise for 50 years. That's all baloney. That's malarkey, as Joe Biden would say. It's just not true. There was no legislative ability to codify Roe v. Wade until right now, and we don't have the ability to do that as a country because of Manchin and Sinema not wanting to abolish the filibuster. So let's just get that out of the way. Now let's look at the actual practical implications of this. So for folks not from the U.S., and we'll just go through this quickly, John, overturning Roe v. Wade does not make abortion illegal in the United States of America across all 50 states. What it does do, though, is, number one, it will allow states to pass their laws like they see fit. So the estimates are 26 states will outlaw abortion in various capacities and ways. You have the most extreme being Oklahoma, which has banned all abortions. And even in the case of incest and rape, they have banned abortion. So it's very, very extreme. And then you'll have other states which may not go as far. You will have the blue states maintain abortion rights so long as they stay in power after November. And then what you're going to have happen is a fight within the Republican Party between different states on how to enforce this. So do they go after women who go and get an abortion? Now, what does that mean? So let's say you're a woman living in Oklahoma. You can't get an abortion, but you see that Minnesota today just signed an executive order saying that any person that comes to Minnesota to get an abortion, they will not comply with the requests of law enforcement officials at other states that have banned abortion, and therefore it will be a safe harbor state. So let's say you go from Oklahoma to Minnesota to get an abortion, you come back, let's say Oklahoma finds out about it because they subpoena Facebook's data or Google's data, and they can verify that you did this. Do they charge the woman with murder or some other type of penalty? Do states, if they do want to charge women for penalties, do they go back? Because murder doesn't have a statute of limitations. What is the statute of limitations on people who got abortions in Oklahoma prior to this ruling? So there's a lot of uncertainty, but basically what you're going to have is a red-blue divide, and there's going to be very little that the federal government can do right now to prevent these red states from outright banning abortion.
I think this narrative that we were describing, where it were Republican appointed justices who wrote and formed majority in a row, and where the very recent Democratic Senate Majority Leader had identified as being pro-life. I mean, I think it really reiterates how this issue has not traditionally necessarily been as polarized as clearly on partisan lines as it is now. Even just in the last presidency under Barack Obama, it was not that uncommon for there to be pro-choice senators in the GOP caucus and pro-life ones in the Democratic caucus. Pennsylvania around that time had a pro-choice Republican, Arlen Specter, at the same time as they had the pro-life Democrat, Bob Casey. But the partisan basis of this issue really has cemented so much, and that's rather remarkable. We were talking with Delia Lithwick about that progression and how in 1973, the conservative movement was still in its nascency. It really kind of got up and running in the 1960s. This was just a few years later. Conservative and Republican weren't necessarily synonyms in the way that people use them now. But even then, the conservative movement was not as activated on this issue as they were on some other issues. And it's over the ensuing decades become almost the North Star of the conservative movement, really the most motivating thing for them. And it's how they've been able to mobilize a base of voters that have prioritized the Supreme Court nomination process above all other issues, which is somewhat remarkable. The other thing that I want to say about this red-blue divide, when we're trying to predict how policy is going to play out now that this issue is being decentralized and put at the state level in this extraordinary way, we're talking about red states and blue states and how Republican-controlled states will enact some of the policies that you've described. It's interesting to recognize that the red-blue polarization at the state level does not necessarily exactly match what we've gotten so used to seeing on the presidential electoral college map. For example, Kentucky, a state that was very strongly Republican voting at the statewide level in presidential elections recently, they've got a Democratic governor, Andy Beshear. He's probably not going to sign up to the most restrictive abortion policies. And then you've also got states like Wisconsin that have been voting consistently, with very, very rare exceptions like 2016, for Democrats on the statewide level. They've got a state Congress, a state legislative body that is very, very skewed towards the GOP and takes some of the most aggressive kind of conservative movement policies at the state level.
Yes, I will say in Kentucky, I think there's a veto-proof majority, so it may not matter what the governor did. And in Kansas, though, to your point, the very red legislature, they will 100%, I believe they've already passed a trigger law. My former boss, my former colleagues is a state representative in Kansas, very pro-life. They're going to ban abortion. Like, that's going to happen. They have a Democratic governor. So to your point, though, politics in the United States is played by a set of rules. No matter how much you hate or love this decision, especially if you hate it, there is nothing you can do in certain circumstances, like when you have a red legislature.
All right, tonight, the fallout from the Supreme Court ruling about abortion rights is growing. This after 3 straight days of protests across America.
From New York to Los Angeles, protesters took to the streets, with angry crowds squaring off with jubilant supporters over the historic ruling that ends a federal constitutional right to abortion and allows states to decide whether or not to ban it. With the ruling, at least 8 states have made abortion illegal, and more than a dozen more expected to ban or severely restrict it. But abortion rights supporters in conservative states are not giving up the legal fight. In Louisiana, abortions resumed after a state court judge temporarily blocked Louisiana's trigger law. In others, abortion rights groups are arguing their state constitutions give more protections than the federal constitution and contain a right to an abortion.
A woman no longer has bodily autonomy to make decisions about her reproductive health care. The state politicians have that authority over her body. And that doesn't jive with the Utah Constitution.
To your point, this is the 1976 Republican platform, the first time that the Republican Party platform ever endorsed a constitutional amendment to outlaw abortion. The question of abortion is a moral one, yada, yada, yada. In our party, we have people that support the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade and others who don't. However, we protest the Supreme Court's intrusion in the family structure and therefore support the enactment of a constitutional law. So that is to say that in 76, that is the first time that these activists were able to get an abortion ban in the Republican Party platform. That's basically almost 50 years ago. And the movement has worked for the last 50 some odd years to then create this purity test where now GOP leaders need to support some type of ban on abortion, overturning Roe. So when we look at what is going to happen next, we all need to understand that the Democrats have not been organizing around abortion as a purity test for 50 years. They do not have the grassroots power that the GOP pro-life movement has. When I was working for a pro-life member, that was the group that had the most energy out of any group we would meet with. We would not only meet with them and take meetings, and these people were passionate, fanatical, depending on how you look at it, but they would also bring hundreds of thousands of people to create a March for Life. And I think it's every year. And you would hear these people, you would see these people, they're all wearing their pro-life shirts. So as a member of Congress that back in 2010 was the Tea Party wave to power that depended on the base ever since 2010. And the dependence grew more and more and more. I think it's very important to note that this is the most powerful segment of the base. And it's why President Trump picked Mike Pence as his VP. And for everybody wondering, you're hearing people saying that, oh, this won't be a national abortion ban. Mike Pence has come out saying that if he's president, he will push for a nationwide abortion ban in the form of a law through Congress. So that is where these people ultimately want to go.
I'm not sure that I agree entirely that the Democrats have not motivated elections and turnout through this issue. You know, my memories of the 2012 presidential election, my memories of the 2016 presidential election, certainly this was a very, very prominent feature of the campaigns that were run. And I know that many Democratic voters really prioritize this issue and talk about it a lot and really care about it a lot. I think that certainly the Democrats were not as successful as the Republicans at building out the Supreme Court. And some of that is due to, a real motivation, prioritization, and strategy. Some of it is due to luck and coincidence. You know, the death of Justice Ginsburg, the death of Justice Scalia at a time when the Republicans had a majority in the Senate. Some of it is coincidence, some of it is organization. It's certainly true that we haven't seen, as they call it, the codification of Roe v. Wade in Congress as being a priority. But I think that perhaps that's because the way that Congress might approach legislating this issue, even with a Democratic majority or trifecta, would actually be a bit narrower than the protections that were in Roe. And so those that really prioritize the widest possible abortion access probably preferred the Roe standard to anything that they would have gotten out of Congress. So I think that the Democrats have cared a lot about this issue. It's been a big part of their election campaigns. You know, as I said, my memory is the 2012 election. This seemed to me like it was the number one issue that the Obama campaign was focused on, frankly. Whether or not that's been matched entirely in the priorities once in office, we could talk about. But I think that as an election matter, it's certainly been a topic of discussion and focus.
A topic of discussion, sure. Focus, I disagree with. So you did in 2007, the primary between Obama and Clinton. President Obama, because the candidate, Hillary Clinton at the time, was running on her female platform, really putting that front and center. President Obama said that this would be the first thing he codified in passing a law in 2007 was the Roe v. Wade protections. But just looking at polling, and we've done this before, but the most recent Gallup polling is 19% of Democrats were abortion voters, 30% of Republicans. Not only that, but the way that the money was being put into these March for Life folks and the way that they were organizing and going out and primarying Republicans on this issue, I think is a little bit different than what was happening in the Democratic Party. And the reason is simple. These people lived it. They felt it. They ultimately were very pissed off by Roe not being overturned at any point in their lives. And that was their goal, very concrete. Whereas people under 50 grew up with Roe being a fundamental right. And it's really hard to abstractly think, oh, these people may take away this fundamental right, which I've always grown up with. I've really never had to worry about because it's been in federal protection. So I think the dynamics were very different, and I think it lended itself to a more cohesive, single issue movement that was structured around the courts. I'd argue largely the creation of FedSoc and the strength and vigor of that conservative judicial movement largely was due to the focus and passion of the pro-life movement. And you just don't see anything similar on the Democratic side. You see Planned Parenthood fundraising, and you see fundraising off of threats, when I was working in Congress, threats of Republicans defunding Planned Parenthood. But it's never really been a tangible way or a tangible threat that Republicans in Congress were going to overturn Roe v. Wade. It was like they need to win 3 elections and then they'll be able to do it. It just so happened that Trump got 3 rather extremist justices appointed to the court.
Well, perhaps then we have an opportunity to kind of draw a contrast in explicitness between the two parties and the mismatch between what's explicitly promise on the campaign trail and then what's actually prioritized in action. It's almost the reverse, isn't it? Where many of the Democratic candidates have said explicitly, this is going to be our priority and we're going to do it. And then they don't. And then on the Republican side, it's done a little bit through almost the opposite. It's done in almost a wink, wink way, where certainly Donald Trump and also all the justices that were nominated by his administration, they never said explicitly that they were aiming to do this. But it was somehow widely understood that this was exactly the goal. There were certainly figures in the conservative movement that were very open that this was the goal. However, Trump, the candidate, never said anything like this that I'm aware of. And the justices themselves that he nominated, they were very sort of vague when they were asked questions about whether they would stand by the Roe precedent. They would say, oh, we understand that it is a precedent. We understand that precedent matters. And they would sort of leave it at that. And it was necessary to read between the lines of their prior writings, their prior rulings, and the fact that they had gone through this FedSoc pipeline that you referenced. I think there's also an interesting contrast with that, because often we hear that, oh, the Democrats don't have the equivalent to FedSoc. They don't have this pipeline of judicial appointees that are ideologically reliable. But it's really a matter of need, isn't it? Because the reason that FedSoc exists and the reason this pipeline exists is because the conservatives were disappointed by the ideological direction of Republican appointees. In particular, Justice David Souter, who was nominated by George Bush, and then also in regard to the abortion issue in particular, Justice Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor were both nominated by Ronald Reagan. So they were expecting that these justices that were appointed by Republicans were going to be reliable with what the conservative movement wanted. And that's why, when they were disappointed in that regard, they had to develop this pipeline. The Democrats haven't had an experience like that I can really think of. I mean, have there been any Democratic appointed justices that have found themselves aligned very often with the conservative side of the bench, that have disappointed the Democratic voting base in ways that are unforgivable, that require infrastructure to be built up to make sure ideological nominees are being nominated? Not really. the Democrats generally appoint justices that they're satisfied with. So there isn't really a need to farm out young judicial talent and direct them in this direction the way that the Republicans have had to do. They haven't had that experience of disappointment. That's really what I think has fueled the judicial strategy of McConnell and the others. It's that sense that we were betrayed by our own nominees. That's really behind a lot of this.
And there's a great book by Tim Alberta. Oh man, I'm forgetting the name of it. But folks, it's really great because it describes the rise of Trump, like from, I want to say, President Obama's time in office to President Trump's. And it takes what you just said, John, about the conservative movement being disappointed in their judges, but it applies it to the conservatives under President George W. Bush and being just supremely disappointed with him taking the moderate road in their eyes on a lot of different things. But I did want to just circle back to a couple things. I agree. So what I was trying to express earlier is the Democrats that mentioned abortion, and you're right, it was very prominent on the primary trail or as a messaging to, oh, this is something we need to do for women's rights. It's similar to how there's a lot of support in the party for gun control, but like 80% of the public, 90% of the public supports universal background checks, but that's not going to get passed because it's support on an issue that was never a priority for the voters that ultimately picked the people to get into office. And that's why we only see gun control after 10 years of the massacre of children, 8 to 10 years old in Sandy Hook and Uvalde. And we see milquetoast, moderate, mealy-mouthed gun control at that. The literally the least that they can do is this gun control that we see. So that is my point in saying that because abortion was a fundamental right and people weren't thinking that it was going to get taken away, voters really weren't energized about it on the left. They were on the right because the dynamics were different. President Trump did, though, promise in an October 16 debate that Roe v. Wade, if he gets elected, is foregone conclusion. It's being overturned because he's going to support, he's pro-life and he's going to pick pro-life justices. But to your point, it wasn't a whole focus of the campaign like Hillary Clinton made it much more so.
What you've said, I agree with, and it reminds me of a point that you've probably heard me make a million times, whether or not I've made it yet on this program or not. And perhaps I already have, but there really is quite an extraordinary contrast between the Democratic and Republican Party in this way. They have the exact opposite fundamental problem when it comes to priorities, where the Democratic Party has too many priorities and cannot choose between them. And the Republican Party has got almost none. And they've got nothing to campaign on, really. And they couldn't even draft a platform because it's an empty basket. If you ask Nancy Pelosi, what do you want to do? She will name 15 things. Immigration reform. I want to have a public option for health insurance. I want universal background checks. I want to codify federal protections for abortion. I want the infrastructure deal. I want increased spending on K-12 education and universal pre-K, on and on and on. There are so many things that they want to do. And they tell the voters, especially the ones that are directly affected by these issues, that their issue is the priority. We're going to do this. And then when you get into office, you only have 6 months in the legislative calendar, which is a real shame because there should be more opportunities to actually make law. But they can't possibly fit all of these things in. And you're going to end up disappointing people who have been promised that their issue is your priority. On the Republican side, it's the opposite problem. Mitch McConnell is so satisfied with the current Senate rules, not because there's anything that's really that important about 60-vote cloture. It's because the rules are perfectly set up for his priorities. The only things that really matter to him are tax cuts and judicial appointments. And you can do both those things without 60-vote cloture because they've already changed the rules for both of those two topics. The rules about budget reconciliation mean that you can change a lot of fiscal policy without 60-vote cloture. And the rules for nominations and appointments were changed by Reid and then McConnell so that they're able to do nominations and appointments without 60-vote cloture. So, the priority thing, it's not really a big problem for him. They can do one law about fiscal policy when they've got a trifecta and then lose the House and carry on rubber stamping appointments. And that's it. And, it's the opposite problem. You've got too many priorities on the platform that can't all fit in. And then the other side, you don't even have a platform. It's empty. In 2020 elections, it's so remarkable. They did not even release a policy platform. So it's really interesting how the two parties are almost mirror images of each other in this sense.
Yeah, no, it is. And let's get into what we've had happen today. So how to go about fixing this. There's really nothing federally that President Biden can do with his pen or magic wand where he can just say, oh, well, the Supreme Court doesn't matter. I'm going to sign into law that abortion is protected for everybody. That's just not how it works, folks. Sinema and Manchin's pro-life, for heck. And Sinema, she grew up in politics as this firebrand progressive, but the minute she got elected in Arizona, she became as moderate a member as there is in the U.S. Senate. So those two refused to remove the filibuster. You need 50 votes to remove the filibuster in the Democratic caucus. They only have potentially 48. So for any type of long-standing fix, what you're going to need to have happen is you're going to need to win 2 more Senate seats. All these senators make a pledge, with the exception of Manchin and Sinema, to remove the filibuster for at least abortion, use that carve-out to pass a law that then codifies Roe. So that is what needs to happen. Now, if that does happen, Speaker Pelosi outlined 3 things that need to be fixed. So 1 would be to codify abortion. 2 would be to ensure that the states ensure data protections for women using reproductive health apps. So if you're using an app to track your period or have anything to do with reproductive health, that data cannot be shared with states and law enforcement that might want that data for, in her eyes, nefarious purposes to deal with the abortion issue. Regardless, though, none of that is going to happen until November if the Democrats have a good showing and ultimately they win. So they win 2 Senate seats that they pick up, and they maintain all the other vulnerable seats in Nevada, New Hampshire, Georgia, for example. So let's look at what that needs to happen. We'll get into the polling in a second. But from my perspective, messaging, now this issue, John, is a massive one for Democrats. It's going to unify Democrats like never seen before on a single social issue where they can get movement at the polls in an election year that was setting up to be a bloodbath, a red wave. If the Democrats use simple and strong language to message about this. So there's 2 things they need to do, John. They need to say the problem is Roe v. Wade being overturned by Republicans, which is going to hurt women and potentially lead to death, bad health outcomes, unwanted pregnancies. So that's the problem. The solution is we get enough senators in that we can remove the filibuster and pass a law to codify Roe. And the way we do that is you come out and vote. So if you come out and vote for us, we will restore women's reproductive health rights. It's a very simple messaging. And then the second thing that they need to do is for men who are not directly affected by this abortion ruling, men who maybe don't even think about abortion, but they see around them, college-educated men, for example, they see all around them that their women in their lives are not only pissed off, but they're hurt by this ruling because they're feeling like it's an attack on a fundamental right. Current Democratic messaging is men for choice, which is shit. It's an awful form of messaging. What they need to do is men protecting women's health, men fighting for women's health. They need to use these active terms, which evokes the emotion that the women around these men are feeling in a way that plays on that rage to get them out to vote. So today we had Kamala Harris come on, interview with CNN's Donna Bash. And what she needed to do was use that fighting and protecting language. And she did. Not great, but she's not great at her job. And what she also did, though, was when Dana Bash asked her, Vice President Harris, do you support removing the filibuster and passing a law that codifies Roe v. Wade? She did not answer that question. And it's a very simple thing, John, but I worry that if the Biden administration is incompetent to the point where they can't use a simple, straightforward, logical message on abortion, that they may not be able to reap the benefits that could be potential from the anger in the electorate.
Biden told my colleague Anderson Cooper he would be okay with eliminating the filibuster to pass voting rights and, quote, maybe more. Would you support eliminating the filibuster in order to pass federal legislation for abortion rights?
Right now, given the current composition of the Senate, the votes aren't there.
But
and so that's
what the pulpit to say, yes, I support it?
Well, here's the thing. I understand why you're asking the question, but the reality of it is we don't even get to really answer that in terms of whether it happens or not if we don't have the numbers in the Senate. And again, that's why I keep coming back to the importance of an election that is only 130 odd days away, because it really does matter. I sit as the vice president, therefore the president of the Senate. I was in the Senate for 4 years representing the state of California. And if you don't have the votes, you can't move anything. We've seen countless examples, sadly, of that. This Senate, in the current composition, would not pass voting rights legislation. I sat in the chair when the Women's Health Act was on the floor for a vote, and we didn't have the votes to get it passed on the issue of Roe, of reproductive health care.
I had an idea for something that they could try legislatively that I mentioned to you that I'll now describe. So you were talking about how there is probably not a Senate majority, especially one that would involve rule changes to codify the Roe protections into law. So I was thinking about how there are social issues where there's a very complex kind of public opinion and legislative opinion situation. And then there's others where it's a bit different. Often abortion and same-sex marriage are compared because they're both considered to be social or cultural issues. They had relatively similar partisan breakdowns in the movements that were supporting and opposing those categories of American rights. And I told you that I didn't have time to read through the opinion, but I did see an excerpt from the concurrence from Justice Clarence Thomas, where he said that not only should Roe versus Wade be overturned, but also the court should reconsider Griswold versus Connecticut, the Lawrence decision, and the Obergefell decision. So this was extraordinary to a lot of people because these were Supreme Court decisions that seemed as though they were in pretty safe ground, unlike Roe, which was always much more controversial legally. So the Griswold decision has to do with contraception, birth control. The Lawrence decision says that sodomy laws, anti-sodomy laws, are unconstitutional. So it has to do with your kind of private, romantic, and personal activity. And then the Obergefell decision was the landmark decision that established a national right to same-sex marriage. I'm against these kinds of what Justin describes as messaging bills, where they're using Senate time just to vote on something that is just meant to count the votes. But I think that because of what Thomas wrote in this concurrence, the same-sex marriage issue is actually a relevant thing for the Senate to consider. Progressives are very disappointed that the Democrats never, as they say, codified Roe. Maybe it's time to look at codifying Obergefell to make a national law about same-sex marriage. Legal expert could talk about whether this is sensible or not. But I think that in light of this concurrence from Thomas, looking at the 6-3 Republican-appointed justice majority in the Supreme Court, it is a relevant matter. And I think that politically, it could be really interesting and worthwhile to count those votes. So there's a real reason to do it as a policy matter. And then politically, it could also be very smart. There's much more of a consensus on the same-sex marriage issue in the American public than there is on what Roe said, which was the point at which abortion was protected, where there's a very complex set of public opinion positions. But on the Obergefell matter, you've got huge majorities of the American public who believe that it's sensible. And it would be pretty interesting to see where the Republican Party really stands on this issue right now, because I think that they've been very satisfied with the status quo under Obergefell and been comfortable not really commenting on it publicly. We know where they stood 10 years ago, but where they stand today on this issue is not really that clear. And it could be pretty interesting to count those votes and to see how many Republicans do support today a national right to same-sex marriage. it could be a pretty interesting thing to do in the run up to the 2022 election.
I like to make predictions. And in this case, I have no idea what would happen. 70% of US citizens support same-sex marriage as of June in a 2021 Gallup poll. So that's pretty high. A lot of people know people in their families, their friends that they care about that have been impacted. This is another example of a right that has been given. When I was working over there, the decision came down and we had people that I was meeting from in the office. I believe they were from Taiwan and they were advocating for trade relations between Kansas and Taiwan. They asked me, maybe they weren't aware that my congressman was super anti-gay marriage, super anti-gay rights, conservative Catholic. But they asked me, could you please take us over to the Supreme Court? And I remember going over to the Supreme Court during the ruling, right after the ruling. And you had people from Republican offices on the balcony overlooking the place where all of the peaceful celebrations were happening. But you walk out and you see the Supreme Court in front of you. It's about 1,000 or 2,000 people, largely the staffers from the damn congressional buildings, but also citizens in DC. And you walk out and then you turn around and look at all the congressional buildings and everybody, Republican offices, Democratic offices, are outside taking pictures, celebrating. In the air, I've been in a lot of protests and a lot of different environments, sporting events. The relief, the sense of joy, jubilation was just, I've never experienced anything like that. So to your point, it is something that is generally liked by a lot of staff on the left, on the right, by a lot of members on the left and the right. But we were talking about the pro-life movement being rather extreme on the right and driving a lot of the party. There is the potential that this extreme movement would drive the Senate not ultimately having 10 GOP votes to codify this. And if it does, then that's a very sad thing for all Americans. But on the other hand, it would be a political boon, another jolt of energy for Democrats heading into the midterms. And then if they do vote to codify it, it's separating the Republican elected officials from the MAGA Trumpland, really prejudiced base that makes up a lot of the pro-life movement and a lot of the anti-gay movement.
Yeah, it's funny, Justin, that you mentioned Taiwan, because that is the only country in Asia that has same-sex marriage, just as a matter of coincidence.
They were thrilled to see it. They're like, oh, this is cool. Like, this is amazing. We're seeing America jump forward.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Obergefell settled the issue in the United States, and everyone has become very comfortable and satisfied with that. But Justice Thomas has made this an issue again. So I think it's appropriate for Congress to consider it. And it would be interesting to see where the Republicans stand on the issue today. I think that Donald Trump, in his campaign, said that he supported same-sex marriage. But I don't know what the current position is of many U.S. senators.
He said he's for the gays. The gays love Donald Trump.
Well, he was never known for being articulate or consistent or policy-oriented or any of the other characteristics that we would look for in a national leader.
Compassionate.
You know, he was someone with every vice and no virtues. But anyway, I'm not sure how many Republicans might vote in favor of this. And I think it would be very interesting to know. I mean, you need 10 to have a cloture vote. And I think it's very possible you could get 10. I mean, I think that Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski would almost certainly vote for federal protection for same-sex marriage. I think that there are some others who perhaps they might have opposed in the past, but today I imagine that they might support it. People like Mitt Romney, Pat Toomey, Lindsey Graham, Richard Burr. I don't know if you can get to 10 or not, but I think that
Bill Cassidy, maybe that's 7.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But I think that it would be pretty interesting and relevant for voters in states like Wisconsin, where Ron Johnson is running for re-election, to know where their senator stands on an issue that Justice Thomas has said is a very relevant one for current policymaking.
And folks, we will get into Ron Johnson. He's a despicable figure, but that'll come when we talk about January 6th. Because what he did there, it's for a different day, John.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, but, relevant to this, too. I mean, he's a U.S. senator who is someone who has a vote on all the stuff that we're talking about now.
Yeah, and he tried to pass along a slate of fake electors to Vice President Pence when it was found out that he did this. Instead of, I don't know, showing any integrity at all, he tried to blame it on a staffer who is just, the power differential there is disgusting. And then to try and blame it on and imply that it's an intern, but it was his chief of staff. It was just bad.
I think he's changed his story about 4 or 5 times too.
He changed it. He's like, well, actually, I did work with a lawyer directly from Wisconsin.
I mean, there's plenty to talk about with Ron Johnson. I mean, some of his connections in Ukraine, as well as his activities in Ukraine, have been very concerning from U.S. national security perspective. He was liaising with someone who was named in a DNI report as being a Russian agent, this guy Andrei Derkach. There's plenty to talk about Ron Johnson, but we'll stay on the matter at hand.
Not to get too far into it, he said that he was glad that the Trump protesters weren't shot, but if there were Black Lives Matter protesters at the January 6th insurrection, he would hope that they all would have been shot. So, I mean, the guy is just, that's blatant racism. You're making me sick, think of him.
Indeed. It might really be worth kind of revisiting this again, because we talked about this in one of the previous episodes, but even if the Republicans are in a favorable economic climate and, cyclical political climate, as we know that there is a common pattern where some houses of Congress will flip after a presidential election and so on. They are going to be in danger of winning some of these Senate races where they've nominated less than ideal candidates, mostly challengers, but also in some cases incumbents. I'm thinking of Ron Johnson. But, challengers, people like Herschel Walker or Mehmet Oz, they haven't nominated always the strongest person available. But in the case of Ron Johnson, he's an incumbent, and he won a very, very surprising re-election in 2016 when the polling was very bad. So you never know, he could pull one off. And I usually very uneasy about celebrating poor nominees, because someone who's nominated can win, and then that person is in the U.S. Senate. I think that some of the dirty tricks that are played to help elevate the weaker candidates I think that's a very poor mode of politics. I know, Claire McCaskill did that with Todd Akin in Missouri. There's a few other examples. Sometimes people celebrate having these weak opponents. It's dangerous to have a weak opponent who would be a dangerous person in office. And, there's a very good chance that anyone who's nominated can win in a closely divided country. And Ron Johnson won, and he's, doing what he's doing. We also didn't even talk about his vaccine stuff.
We got to get back onto abortion, but you bring up Claire McCaskill. First, Ron Johnson was initially a solid candidate, a solid conservative, sensible businessman who made a lot of money. And then he just lost his mind at some point. Maybe he was always a crazy racist asshole, but it's very apparent now that this is who he is. Claire McCaskill, I was talking to somebody today about this, John, and they're like, be careful with Greitens because of what you're saying. And folks, you have to realize that in the Pennsylvania governor's race, you have a very crazy, extreme January 6th truther.
That's a great example of what I'm talking about, yeah.
Who's running for election.
Doug Mastriano,
who's only 4 points down in the polls, who would ban all abortions in Pennsylvania if he's elected. So that's an example. But just to close the loop on Claire McCaskill, who's a beloved MSNBC liberal commentator now, this person who knows a lot about Missouri politics, they've grown up in Missouri, they're pretty high up now in D.C., they said that Claire McCaskill failed upward. She runs some of the worst campaigns. She got very lucky that Todd Akin was the person that she was running against. So, John, I think that she knew.
Well, it was more than luck, Justin. You remember what happened, right?
Yes, it was about abortion.
Well, they ran ads in the primary elevating Akin, hoping that he would be the nominee because he was beatable. This is why I mentioned McCaskill and Akin.
But she probably still would have lost if he didn't say that women can prevent getting raped or whatever the crazy. I think what Todd Akin said was, if women don't want to be raped, they can prevent a child from happening. And it was some crazy, egregious, ridiculous.
Yeah, he used the term legitimate rape, and he said that the body has a way of shutting that down.
Thank you. That's like the earth is only 4,000 years old thinking, and we got to blame Eve for eating the apple.
Well, this is part of what I was actually thinking of when I said that in the 2012 election cycle, there was a lot of focus on the abortion issue. And I didn't think that Democrats were ignoring it because it was a very prominent part of that election campaign
Well,
that I remember very well.
Well, yes, I take that. It wasn't a nationwide thing, though, like what it always has been for Republicans.
Sometimes these sorts of candidates do get nationalized in a way that reflects on the party. And I think that that's a lot of what happened in that case, because, you know, the comments that came from Aiken and also similar comments that came from a candidate called Richard Murdoch in Indiana in the same cycle, the Democrats associated those comments with Governor Romney's campaign. And they said, you know, Governor Romney doesn't
Binder
support
full of women.
Well, it was mostly that Governor Romney didn't support the contraception mandate in the ACA, which was an employer mandate that employers had to provide contraception in the health insurance coverage that they offered employees. So this was something that Governor Romney didn't support. And the comments that came from some of these other candidates, Aiken, Murdoch, the Democrats were very successfully able to associate them with Governor Romney and his positions in a sort of adjacent matter. And so I think that there definitely have been cycles where the Democrats have been very much on offense with this issue. And I think that sometimes what's kind of funny in this political partisan world is that both sides seem to think that the other is absolutely ruthless. I know that if you listen to Steve Bannon talk about Democrats, progressives wouldn't recognize the people that Bannon is talking about. He talks about Democrats as if they're the most militant, ruthless, organized group of political actors imaginable. I mean, think about how many Republicans believe that the Democrats executed this nationwide, highly complex conspiracy to steal the election that involved thousands of election workers and in dozens and dozens of states. And that they got away with it, that they somehow were able to manipulate the court system to support this. I mean, they believe that the Democrats are completely ruthless and militant. And the Democrats themselves think they're a bunch of softies. It's kind of the other way around, too. I mean, the Republicans, they often talk about how they're weak. They say, our leadership are weak, weak, weak. We need strong people. The Democrats don't recognize the people that Republicans are talking about here either. They say, you know, it's funny because we think your leaders are so ruthless. It's a little bit like this. I mean, I do think that the Democrats have been on offense on abortion pretty often. And I know that a lot of progressives don't think that, but I think that that has been the case. Yeah.
I don't either. And I'm a pretty big centrist. I would disagree.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of that 2012 election cycle, where it was kind of one of the most powerful and successful issues that the Democratic campaigns were able to use to get a really big victory. So I think that they're not completely unaccustomed to being on offense in this issue. And I think that it's going to put them into, you know, we shouldn't be talking about this issue just in terms of campaigns and politics, but I think that, you know, maybe they're going to feel a little bit stronger going into the elections.
Yeah, let's jump into that. I'd argue immigration was the big Obama issue in 2012. But anyways, we digress. John and I can disagree. So let's look at the polling. Let's see what is happening. So I mentioned Vice President Harris coming out today in an interview, and for the Democrats to have any success on this issue that does more than just change things at the margins, they need to have strong and clear messaging. Vice President Harris refused to do that on her first comments nationally about abortion. I think it's despicable. I think it's short-sighted. I think it goes with her long history of having an inability to really campaign thoughtfully and strategically. And it could be coming from President Biden. President Biden could say, you can't say this out loud. We don't have the votes right now. So if we don't have the votes right now, we don't want to pressure Manchin and Sinema. But John, the way that Democrats need to do this, the way that President Biden needs to do this, the way that Kamala Harris needs to do this, if they want to say they don't have the votes right now, so they don't set up false expectations, you say, right now, we are working in the White House to get something through Congress. To do this, we need to eliminate the filibuster. Currently, Sinema and Manchin do not want to eliminate the filibuster. We understand that. We think this is absolutely irresponsible. It's unacceptable, and we're going to pressure them. If we are not successful in pressuring them to remove the filibuster and codify Roe v. Wade and protect millions and tens of millions of women all around America, then what we're going to do is we're going to have to get out and vote. We're going to have to get 2 more senators in this November election. We're going to have to maintain all the other senators in New Hampshire, Georgia, Nevada. And then what we will do is we will eliminate the filibuster and pass the filibuster so that voters here vote 2 more Democrats in, eliminate filibuster, get abortion protections. That did not happen today from the vice president. As the vice president's interview was leaking, though, John, I think it's very interesting to note that Speaker Pelosi came out, and maybe the first time that I've noticed her wading into Senate procedure as strongly as she did. She listed her approaches, her desires, and she said ultimately, to get all of this done, we're going to need a vote in November and then eliminate the filibuster. And she's saying we need 2 more senators in there. So this is important because you have the progressives, friends of mine who work in DC. We get in arguments about this. Abortions. Folks, if you're not in DC, try being in DC right now with this abortion ruling. There are just passionate arguments between friends on both sides of the aisle, on the same side of the aisle, about this topic going for hours. I think yesterday's argument I had for 2 or 3 hours with a progressive friend. And they were basically saying that they don't trust the Biden administration. They don't trust moderates in Congress to actually maintain a pledge, eliminate the filibuster, and do this in November because they're moderates. So the fact that Harris just played into that, I think is terrible. But I think it's also why Speaker Pelosi, who's an establishment, who's viewed as a moderate by progressives, she's not a moderate. She's a little bit left of moderate. That's why she came out. So I think there is the potential to message on this issue, and I'll give you a chance there, and then we can get into some polling.
Let me just say very quickly that the categorization of moderates and progressives, and, I've been using that a little bit in this conversation too. It can sometimes be a little bit deceptive. I know that there are many people who are generally centrist who prioritize social issues above some of the economic issues, for example. And so often some of the centrists in the Democratic Party might actually be the ones who care the most about Roe v. Wade and the most about abortion. You could compare Neera Tanden to Bernie Sanders. The one who probably is more interested in the abortion issue and puts a greater priority on it would be Neera Tanden, right? Again, like these kinds of, the idea that everyone fits on one line, that the political spectrum, it's often much more complex. But in regard to your overall point there about Vice President Harris and the way that she approached this interview, I agree with you that I definitely feel that there's a lot of disappointment that the administration broadly haven't really been using, the bully pulpit, as Theodore Roosevelt called it, a little bit more aggressively. They don't often seem to have been on the front foot of political messaging for the last year, which it is disappointing to people, especially who have been used to presidents like Donald Trump and Barack Obama, who always seem to be driving the news cycle and what they say. We're not really seeing that from President Biden or Vice President Harris. About the strategy that you've suggested, it seems pretty sensible to me, but I will say that it's proven to be a pretty risky thing to put pressure on Senator Manchin. It makes sense to do so, kind of to move it away from the White House and say, look, we're ready to do this, but we're waiting for some of our colleagues. And they're the ones that need to decide that we're going to take this step. I mean, because that is the situation. It's an accurate characterization of what's going on. But, this whole Manchin thing has been the biggest parlor game in Washington. I can't possibly dive into it and join the psychodrama and Freudian analysis of whatever he's thinking and doing. And there's already too many people doing that. But I will say that, at least from what I can observe, putting the ball in his court and putting all the pressure on him seems to have backfired on some of the negotiations over the Build Back Better spending bill. So I think that maybe they're being a little bit more careful about the way that they talk about Senator Manchin because of this recent experience. But again, I think what you're saying sounds perfectly sensible on its face, but I imagine that's a lot of what the calculus is.
Agree with you. This is a good point you brought up. I think that they are trying to get one more piece of legislation through with Manchin's blessing, whether it be capping drug prices or something. Here's my argument, and here's where I feel about it. I'm not a woman, so abortion is nothing that directly impacts me like it does, 51% of the population here. But I do have a lot of friends that are women and females, and I see how mad they are and angry they are. And it's enough is enough, my friend. The White House needs to use this in a way that can ultimately get a law passed as soon as possible. I think that that's in November, if they win. So I think they need to put pressure on Manchin. If he threatens to leave the party, that would be awful, but there's a potential to get somebody else in a different seat to replace him. And in a way of putting pressure on him, that is also a way of showing voters, here's the obstacle. We're telling you to go vote. We're telling you to go vote because it passed the House, but it can't get through the Senate because we need 2 more votes in the Senate. So it's showing proof, right? And then you make Manchin and Sinema vote on removing the filibuster for abortion. Now, let's get into the polling, though, because, John, I've been saying this is going to be a red wave. It's going to be a red wave, guys. It's going to be a red wave. They're going to win 20, 30, 40 seats in the House. They're probably going to take back the Senate. That kind of comported. The last NPR Marist poll for Congress was in April, and it had Republicans +3 on the generic ballot. That is a ton, because to maintain the House, Democrats need to be +6 or +8 on the generic ballot. After the January 6th hearings, but I would argue it's more so the abortion ruling, there was another poll done from Friday and Saturday. It has been a 10-point swing from +3 to the Republicans to +7 to the Democrats on this generic poll. Furthermore, there was another poll that I saw covered in The Hill that said 62% of voters have a requirement that the person that they're voting for must be in favor of abortion rights. Now, it gets a little murky on what do abortion rights mean. But John, I will say this. I was confident in a red wave because of inflation, baby formula, food prices, gas prices. You had the Afghanistan pullout, which was haphazard. You had the Ukraine issue, which was haphazard. You had progressives pissed off because Build Back Better didn't get through. You had moderates wanting just a normal type of presidency, but because of the Biden administration's inability to message, you had them depressed. You had young voters just pissed off about a bunch of things. They didn't get $2,000 in checks. They got $1,400 at the start of the year. And Biden was just disappeared. I think that if they message properly, like a 12th grader could message on this issue, not a genius, that I think that this could ultimately shape the form of the elections in November, and the Democrats could win those 2 Senate seats. They could hold the House, and we could have something historic where it bucks trend lines with the parties, like you mentioned, in power. It bucks economic trend lines, and this could be a true watershed moment.
Justin, I heard the litany of issues that you mentioned in your prediction that the Democrats were going to have a bad election, and I think most of them are good examples. The Ukraine one did jump out at me. I'm not sure. Do we have polling on how the U.S. government have handled Ukraine? Because
it's shocking. Biden does not get credit for it. He's polling in like the 30s.
Strange, because most expert assessment that I've seen, most media coverage, most people that I trust that I've spoken to seem to think that he's done a pretty good job handling this.
I think he's done exceptionally, but reality versus perception are different, right?
What I want to add, though, is that by giving this litany of major events that have occurred in the last year, what it reiterates is how quickly events occur and how we're sitting here at the end of June. We've got many months to go before the elections, and a lot more is going to happen. The only thing that we know for sure is that the news and events will continue. I think that that's something, and I think I said this in one of our other programs, but something that many people did not quite appreciate. When Biden was elected, they thought the news was going to stop. That it was going to slow down, certainly, if not stop, because of the insane constancy of news emergencies during the Trump years. Going back to normal meant that we could all kind of tune out news and carry on with our personal lives. But that is never a fair prediction, because the news will never stop. I mean, when we had President George Bush, who was a rather bland and managerial sort of person, that was when we had some of the biggest world events in our history occur. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, the Gulf War, the invasion of Kuwait, Events will never stop no matter who's president. And that is certainly the case as we head towards the end of the year. I mean, a few months ago, we already had the idea that the Supreme Court were ready to overturn Roe v. Wade. So this was not entirely unexpected, frankly. But it is a big news event that is going to make a big difference in the way the American public think about government, just like all the other things that you mentioned. And that's going to keep happening. And that's why I'm always a little bit more reticent than you are, Justin, to make very confident predictions of outcomes.
me, like anybody else, doesn't know what's going to happen. So I do want to put that out there. Folks, you hear these predictions, nobody knows. But what I'm trying to do is give you my honest feeling. I'm not just saying it to get a hot take here. This is how I feel about it. And it reminds me of something. So the gun issue, right? We got very passionate about that issue here on this show. People across the country were very passionate about the gun issue on this show. The gun issue stayed in the focus for 10, 12 days. That's not going to happen with abortion. The spark was the leaked opinion. And then from the leaked opinion, now you have a fire just absolutely raging. Gasoline will be poured on this fire in a good way from a Democratic energy perspective, because this is, to me personally, this is going to remind me very similarly to the George Floyd protests in that movement. You had this awful, horrific thing happen where a gentleman was murdered by a racist cop on TV nationally. And then from that, you had a coverage of it for 2 weeks. After the coverage of it for 2 weeks, you had protests for basically 2 months, and the news stayed focused on it. I think these protests are going to take a different nature. I think that the right is not going to have the ability to make up stuff about these protests like they did the George Floyd protests. And I think that this energy, if harnessed properly, will not only lead to donations, but it's going to lead to grassroots movements springing up. It's going to lead to suburban white women who liked Trump a lot. They're going to start to break away. It's going to move Hispanic voters. I think 58% are pro Roe v. Wade. So there's some type of misconception out there that Hispanics are super religious, so they're not in favor of abortion at all. That's just not the case. Almost every single demographic supports Roe v. Wade protections. I think that because of the nature of this, because this is so different than our 24-hour news cycle, that this is just going to stay front of mind. The last thing I'll say is, there's a quote from a philosopher, I can't remember it verbatim, but basically, you never have a people fight as much for anything than them fighting for a freedom that they've once tasted and has been pulled away from them. And from my life, John, I think it would probably be the majority of Americans that are alive. We've been born in a time where this was a fundamental freedom. Now, not only is this gone for many Americans, but there's a very real chance that same-sex marriage could be gone. 57% of Americans agree that same-sex marriage is next. So once you start taking away freedoms from people, that's when you get people really pissed off, especially when you have a country that's very individualistic and built on this abstract notion of freedom. So I think that this and the response I'm seeing is groundbreaking.
In what you've just said, Justin, you referenced how quickly the public attention moved on from guns. And I just want to add that that was not before an actual law has been passed and signed into law on gun safety against all odds. And we've talked about how much the deck is stacked in one direction because of equal representation of states in the U.S. Senate, because of bicameralism, because of the Supreme Court, because of Citizens United and all of the financial advocacy on behalf of the gun industry. But it still was possible to do something, even something very modest.
Another prediction I was wrong on.
Indeed. And perhaps we should keep that in mind as we look ahead to this issue. That despite all of the disadvantages that one side might have in the construction of the political system, with sustained attention and advocacy and prioritization from lawmakers and decision makers, something might indeed happen, especially with the kind of groundswell of public activism that you suggested will most likely occur and continue on a very sustained level.
That concludes today's conversation. Again, huge thanks to John and Justin, and to you for being here. If you'd like to hear past episodes or sign up for our email newsletter, which will deliver our best of directly to your inbox, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode coming this Friday. This has been Politics and Media 101. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founders, Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, we hope to hear from you soon.